Just some background. This talk is based on one of the chapters of my book that just came out, Plots Against Russia. This is the theoretical chapter, and I'm going to be making an argument that is, I hope, sort of heretical in conspiracy studies, in that I'm actually going to try to redeem the idea of paranoia, but in a particular way, by destigmatizing paranoia. So that is my goal, and in about 40 minutes you can tell me if I've succeeded, or just don't, actually. Don't tell me if I've succeeded, because I'm stuck with this as it is now. All right, so you heard about Richard Hofstadter. I'm going to talk about Richard Hofstadter again for a minute. So Richard Hofstadter delivered his now famous talk, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, at Oxford on November 21st, 1963, the day before the Kennedy assassination, and with a time difference, possibly the day of the Kennedy assassination. Such fortuitous timing really should be the basis of its very own conspiracy theory. But to the best of my knowledge, no one has gone looking on the grassy knoll for signs of a Hofstadter connection. Published a year later in Harper's Magazine, it would serve as the anchor to an essay collection of the same title in 1965. Though now widely criticized by conspiracy scholars, it is still their most frequent point of departure, along with Popper. While Hofstadter's essay is unquestionably valuable on its own terms, its time of origin and publication are part of the reason the paranoid style is still the center of gravity in conspiracy studies. It coincided with American conspiracy's primal scene, the Kennedy assassination, and was thoroughly engaged with the hysterical political climate that followed. Hofstadter's essay, while examining a trend he saw in more than one period in American history, was a response to Barry Goldwater's campaign for the presidency, a campaign with strong support from the anti-communist fringe John Birch Society. Goldwater's campaign was widely seen as extremist, a term that the candidate himself did not entirely disavow. As he said when accepting the Republican nomination, extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. Whatever one might think of Hofstadter's broader claims, the election of Donald Trump demonstrates how timely his essay has become once again. It is Hofstadter who brought conspiracy and paranoia into the contemporary political and cultural lexicon. This is due in no small part to Hofstadter's eloquence and clarity, but also, once again, to timing. Whether or not a paranoid style was perennial in American history, it seemed self-evident in the mid-1960s. Central to Hofstadter's paranoid style is, quote, the feeling of persecution, unquote, which is, quote, systematized in grandiose theories of conspiracy, along with a tendency to see the enemy as a perfect model of malice. The distinguishing thing about the paranoid style is not that its exponents see conspiracies or plots here and there in history, but that they regard a vast or gigantic conspiracy as the motive force in historical events. History is a conspiracy set in motion by demonic forces of almost transcendent power, and what is felt to be needed to defeat it is not the usual methods of political give and take, but an all-out crusade. The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of this conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. Thus, Hofstadter proposes a model of conspiracy theorizing whose persuasiveness is based on an intelligent restatement of an idea that immediately appears obvious, but that the reader might not have come up with on their own. Hofstadter restates what we already know, but might not be aware of knowing. Since Hofstadter's time, a number of scholars, most notably Peter Knight, Jack Bratish, Brian Keeley, and Michael Barkun, have developed much more sophisticated models of conspiracy theories thanks to the insights of modern media theory, post-structuralism, and cultural studies, not to mention the thematic primacy of conspiracy in post-Hofstadter mass culture. After paying deference to Hofstadter, they all take issue with his chosen term, the paranoid style. Paranoia is so frequently linked with conspiracy theories in the media and mass entertainment that it is difficult to imagine decoupling the terms. Given the clear overlap between the two concepts, their pairing may have been inevitable, but it was Hofstadter who brought the language of popularized psychoanalysis to the world of popular politics. This move is largely responsible both for his essay's success and its harsh criticism by subsequent scholars. Hofstadter is quick to disavow any suggestion of psychological diagnosis in his use of the term paranoid. Paranoid for Hofstadter is essentially a metaphor, and one that fits perfectly with the term's use in ordinary conversation. You're just being paranoid. The scholars who have come after Hofstadter were educated in a milieu that takes metaphor seriously, treating it with justifiable suspicion, if not paranoia. There is a better way to account for a possible relationship between non-clinical paranoia and conspiracy theories, but proposing it requires some familiarity with the alternative frameworks developed since Hofstadter's time. These frameworks are built on a shift in vocabulary that also suggests a shift in discipline, the replacement of psychology with philosophy. While much of contemporary conspiracy theory scholarship pays less attention to the theorizers and more to the theories, when the belief in conspiracy theory comes up, the flaw attributed to the believer is generally posited to be epistemological. Frederick Jameson famously sees conspiracy as, quote, the poor person's cognitive mapping in the postmodern age, while Mark Fenster argues that conspiracy theory works as a form of hyperactive semiosis in which history and politics serve as reservoirs of signs that demand overinterpretation and that signify for the interpreter far more than their conventional meaning. Most of these approaches are united by emphasis on the believer's insistence on seeing connections. Conspiracy theorists, asserts Keeley, are some of the last believers in an ordered universe. But it is the work of Michael Barkun that most thoroughly explores this particular understanding of conspiratorial epistemology. He writes, a conspiracist worldview implies a universe governed by design rather than by randomness. And he finds this emphasis on design expressed in three principles found in virtually every conspiracy theory. Nothing happens by accident, nothing is as it seems, and everything is connected. And I think these are the ideas that in the popular consciousness get associated with the conspiracy theories. Barkun's emphasis on connectivity leads him to think big. In A Culture of Conspiracy, Barkun pays particular close attention to the super conspiracy, the conspiracy that encompasses all other conspiracies. For Barkun, the essentially syncretic nature of conspiracy theory means that what non-believers might dismiss as contradictions are easily assimilated into the conspiratorial logic. What the hapless heroes of Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum do as a joke, forging a master conspiracy as a satirical response to the conspiracists whose work they publish, Barkun studies as the ethnography of the digital age. The super conspiracy is a compelling concept, but its size tends to obscure everything that might fall outside of its shadow, fall under its shadow, I should say. The alternative I'm presenting will be as much micro as macro. While not ignoring connectivity, it will dwell on the specific, singular moments of connection. For our purposes, while it is important to acknowledge the reality of some conspiracies and the possible reality of others, truth value is not the primary concern. It doesn't matter for this particular discussion whether or not the conspiracy is true. There is a range that runs from the conspiracy theory as habit or default to conspiracy as a mode available for adoption. In other words, we're looking at the conspiratorial subject position, and that brings us back to paranoia. Narrative is conspiracy, and paranoia is how we read and understand it. So far, the study of conspiracy has focused on the obvious targets, full-blown conspiratorial narratives and full-time conspiracy theorists. But for most of us, conspiracy and paranoia are part-time jobs. We are adjuncts at conspiracy. When we call something a conspiracy theory, or when we label someone non-clinically paranoid, our primary motivation has less to do with the objective truth of the theory or assertion than it does with our evaluation of a point of view. Can the assertion be treated as implicit evidence of a highly suspicious stance? Does it suggest a possible excessive emphasis on connectivity and a rejection of coincidence? Can we then assume that the author of the assertion is habitually suspicious, preoccupied with making connections, and dismissive of mere chance? Or could it be that both warranted and unwarranted conspiracy theories are more likely to be uncovered by someone with precisely these habits of mind? Even the most earnest attempts at rehabilitating conspiracy cannot escape the hygienic impulse to distance conspirators from everybody else. The attempt to decouple paranoia and conspiracy try to free conspiracy from its stigma by entirely displacing that stigma onto paranoia. Part of the problem with our discussion of conspiracy theory and paranoia is that it's predicated on a Cartesian model of the subject, one which presumes an integral self. When we talk about belief in conspiracy, about debunking conspiracy, we implicitly posit a subject who is either thoroughly rational or wholly irrational. But what if we try to think not in terms of subjects, but subject positions? To do so requires that instead of isolating conspiracy from paranoia, we double down on the connection between the two. What I'm proposing is a continuum from isolated instances of suspicion to full-fledged paranoia, a conspiratorial spectrum on which we can all be located even as these locations may be subject to dynamic change. The primary components of a conspiratorial outlook are features of human psychology that can generally be considered adaptive and useful. The search for patterns and the assumptions of intent. The issue of pattern recognition in conspiracy and paranoia has been raised by a number of scholars, and its role is rather obvious. The urge to connect disparate events into a conspiratorial pattern is akin to the tradition of assigning random stars to constellations. Moreover, patterns once seen are difficult to unsee. At its most benign, paranoia is not psychosis, it's phenomenology. It is a mistake to use politics and the real world as a starting point for understanding conspiracy. Conspiracy belongs first to art, then to ideology. So now I'm arguing that conspiracy's natural home is art rather than politics. And is this just perversity for its own sake on my part? Not that there's anything wrong with that. Or is there, as a conspiracy theorist might say, a hidden agenda? Of course there is, but now I'm going to unhide it. Without getting bogged down in the depths of high theory, there was always something productive in Jacques Derrida's insistence on reversing binaries and exploring the result, most notably in his assertion of the primacy of writing over voice. As a thought experiment at the very least, such perverse reversals capitalize on estrangement and generate new connections and approaches. They also help me address intent and belief. What does it mean to take a conspiracy theory seriously? And more provocatively, what would it mean to take conspiracy as unserious, playful, artificial, artistic? In signature event context, a polemic with John Searle over ordinary language, Derrida offers a critique of John Austin's speech act theory that, however indirectly, helps me make my case. In How to Do Things with Words, Austin initially divides utterances into two categories: constative, statements that can be evaluated according to their truth value, such as the cat is on the mat. Linguists are obsessed with cats on the mat. And performative, statements that are best considered as either succeeding or failing in doing something. I sentence you to life in prison. That is a performance that, in my case, failed. After explaining this distinction in exhaustive detail, Austin then concludes that it is not quite accurate. Many utterances have truth value and an effective result, as well as an effect on the listener. The sentence, "Your hair is on fire," is either true or false, contains the deep structure of a performative act, "I declare that your hair is on fire," and no doubt has an effect on the person to whom it is addressed, one would hope. Derrida commends Austin for what he sees as a fundamentally deconstructive move, establishing a binary, that is between the performative and the constative, showing its limits and contradictions, but leaving the binary available as a nonetheless useful construct despite its problems. But where he takes Austin to task, and where he argues with Searle, is on the question of seriousness. Austin insists that for an utterance to be evaluated according to its felicity, that is, its effectiveness, it must not be a joke or part of a fictional context. Thus, the statement, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," has to be made by someone empowered to do so and in a serious context, and not, for example, on stage. Derrida's objections are twofold. First, Austin's distinction requires that we evaluate an utterance according to the speaker's intent, which can be unknowable, contradictory, and in any case irrelevant. Second, and more important for our purposes, it leaves the entire category of playful speech outside the realm of ordinary language. Instead, Derrida argues that playfulness and seriousness are simply another binary in relation to which an utterance can be assessed, and that any theory of language can claim validity only if it allows for play, which he says is a fundamental part of both speech and writing. The same holds true for conspiracy theory. You might have been wondering where conspiracy theory was on all this. Since we cannot always be sure of the intent behind articulations of a given conspiratorial idea, this is something that comes up a lot in discussions of Russian media. Are people really believing the stuff that they're saying? We should be able to address it separately from its seriousness as a political program or political critique. This releases us from the obligation to determine if a given political actor is serious or cynical when engaging in conspiratorial speculation. More generally, we can examine both sincere conspiracy and its satire through not just the tropes common to both, but also the epistemological stance adopted or satirized. But the most important consequence of the acceptance of play is the recognition of the weakness of the boundaries between the political and the artistic, between conspiracy as argument and conspiracy as entertainment. In other words, we are back to conspiracy as plot in all the senses of the word. No discussion of conspiracy in the last 2 decades is complete without at least invoking The X-Files. Over the course of 9 seasons, which was at least 3 seasons too long, Chris Carter's genre-bending hit television show made conspiracy a household name. When it returned after a decade's absence, it had all the freshness of revelations about NASA's fake moon landings, but it still remains unrivaled as a touchstone for all conversations about conspiracy in popular entertainment. I bring up the X-Files not as either the cause or symptom of the mainstream of conspiracy and paranoia, but simply as the most legible example of conspiracy as entertainment, in order to get at the question of conspiracy and play. The experience of watching The X-Files is all about paranoid subject positions. As an hour of television, The X-Files, like any other televised fiction, should make us aware of the conventions of drama. If we start watching an episode of Law & Order or CSI, we do not expect the culprit behind the evening's murder to be aliens. Indeed, they simply cannot be aliens. If we're watching The X-Files, however, aliens are not just possible, but plausible. Let's say that we, like so many viewers in the 1990s, enjoy and appreciate both The X-Files and Law & Order, and might go from watching one of them at 8 o'clock to watching the other at 9 o'clock. For the first hour, we're willing to believe in aliens, at least within the confines of the story, but for the next, we rule them out entirely. First we're Mulder, then we're Scully. The point is not that The X-Files turns us into true believers in aliens. More important is the way in which fiction allows and even requires an audience to temporarily adopt a subject position that might otherwise be alien. One could even read all the X-Files alien abduction narratives in terms of the infiltration of viewers by an alien subject position. Immersion in fiction produces, if not an altered state, then an altered subjectivity. For brief periods of time, we adopt the position of believer in superpowered mutants, happy intergenerational romance, or the efficacy of torture. That one is a real killer for me, because I hate watched every season of 24, believe that torture is not effective, and as a viewer was waiting for Jack Bauer to effectively use torture, and I believed that was going to work. A fictional narrative that cannot temporarily convince us of something we might otherwise doubt is a failure. If you spend the entire duration of a musical wondering how it is that all the characters know the lyrics and dance steps, then the musical has not convinced you to inhabit the temporary selfhood of someone who takes these things for granted. All of this returns us to Derrida's notion of the possibility of play as a precondition to the serious. If we can't believe in a conspiratorial fiction that calls itself fiction, we will never commit to a conspiratorial fiction that calls itself fact. We identify a paranoid subject position in others because we have experienced it ourselves. If we keep conspiracy at a distance, we can see fiction as a laboratory for the careful containment of conspiratorial notions. But if we're less convinced by the epistemological boundaries between fiction and fact, then the circulation of motifs between entertainment and politics should come as no surprise. Moreover, the very conventions of narrative encourage interpretive habits that in other contexts look paranoid. The expectation that nothing is random or extraneous, and that the entire story is the result of careful design. Good readers make good paranoids. If conspiracy can be a game and paranoia can be playful, we need to broaden our understanding of both phenomena. More and more critics reject the paranoid label for conspiracy theorists as a way to fight against the social hygienic impulse, that conspiracy theorists are all raving lunatics wearing tinfoil hats. But their goal is, more often than not, to rehabilitate discussions of real conspiracies by distinguishing them from their lunatic fringe counterparts. The distinction still comes down to truth for conspiracy and sanity for paranoia. My point is broader. True and false conspiracy theories share the same basic structure, and all of them function as the predicate for a paranoid or conspiratorial subject position. Moreover, I want to complicate one further category that often frames these discussions: sincerity of intent versus cynical manipulation. Presumably, at least some of those who espouse a given conspiracy theory are concerned more with the theory's utility than its veracity. Here, too, we have an often unanswerable question of another person's motives. And here, too, I propose setting aside this question as functionally, but not politically, irrelevant. This brings me back to my earlier proposal of a conspiratorial continuum, a paranoid spectrum to locate anything from a discrete utterance to a full-blown narrative. If we can adopt a paranoid stance when enjoying conspiratorial entertainment, or more broadly, when analyzing an artistic text under the assumption that it is a maximally consistent system rather than a set of randomly arranged events, we can adopt and discard a similar paranoid stance towards more serious matters, such as politics, ideologies, or world affairs. So what I'm getting at here is that you read a novel or watch a film, and you expect things to make sense, to come together, and for events not to be completely random. Now, in life, of course, things can be completely random, but if they are in fiction, it can more often than not feel like bad fiction. We have heightened expectations of cohesiveness. So if I seem strangely comfortable with the word paranoid when most contemporary conspiracy scholars do their best to avoid it, it is because the word is not attached to a person, or at least not as a long-term or permanent attribute. It's not a diagnosis because there is no person to diagnose. True, the paranoid or conspiratorial subject position does imply a subject, but it is a temporary subject, or a subject at a given moment rather than over a long term. In a distinction that probably works better in Spanish, ser versus estar, the subject is not paranoid, but is being paranoid at the moment. This is where Hofstadter's notion of a paranoid style can be reclaimed. As a style, paranoia does not have to be a long-term attribute or characteristic of an individual subject. But where Hofstadter's unit of measure is an entire text, say the speech of a particularly radical conspiracy theorist, mine is the sentence itself or the utterance. I propose treating paranoia not as a style, but as a mode. This brings paranoia closer to irony, which is of course ironic, because by rights, irony should be conspiracy's kryptonite. So what does conspiracy look like when broken down to its smallest units? Approaching conspiracy only as a system of connections means falling into the trap of conspiratorial thought, reproducing a monomaniacal gigantism. It's all connected, and it's huge, even when the goal is to debunk. Conspiratorial thought is most recognizable as a system, but its operation and circulation prove far broader and far messier when it escapes the boundaries of the systematic. These boundaries are entirely notional and result from choosing the full-fledged conspiracy theory as the primary object of study. Returning to the level of the conspiratorial utterance, we exchange the macro view of the system with the micro perspective of the meme. Now, after more than a decade of social media, nearly everyone knows what a meme is. Or more to the point, nearly everyone thinks they know what a meme is, but are technically wrong. The beauty of that error is, though, that in misunderstanding memes, they create new evidence in support of meme theory, because meme theory is precisely about the ability to create new meanings by accident and by mistake. Coined by Richard Dawkins in 1976's The Selfish Gene, the word meme is meant to cover any unit of information that can be transmitted from person to person or mind to mind, regardless of the means of transmission. Dawkins argues that in any system involving information to be replicated, vehicles for the replication, scarce resources, and the possibility of error, the result will be evolution. In biological terms, he's talking about genes, the information, and biological organisms, the replicators, with evolution resulting from the occasionally imperfect copying of genes from one generation to another, occasionally giving rise to a mutation that will prove useful and passed on. In applying Darwinian principles to information and culture, Dawkins is much more modest than most of his predecessors. That's probably the only time anyone's used the word modest for Richard Dawkins. The only biological drive he posits is the impulse to copy, an impulse we see in basic child development. What actually gets copied, information or culture, is independent of physical biology. So a meme is simply any unit of information. The opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Bartleby the Scrivener's famous expression of disinterest, or even an obscure sentence written down once 300 years ago in a book that no one has ever read. Like genes, memes have a reproductive strategy, catchiness. Catchiness is what ensures the survival and transmission of Beethoven's Fifth, while its lack is what ensures that my hypothetical 300-year-old sentence will never have any offspring. That is, copies of themselves will never be written or spoken by others because this book is never opened. Information evolves precisely because transmission is riddled with errors, such as mishearings or typos. Bartleby's catchphrase, "I would prefer not to," is sometimes misremembered as "I would prefer not," a new meme resulting from the old. Elton John never sang "Hold Me Closer, Tony Danza," nor did Pat Benatar invite listeners to "Hit Me With Your Pet Shark." But such perceptual errors have doubtlessly produced new texts and new meanings, not to mention new t-shirts. In common parlance, memes are now simply images, videos, and catchphrases spread throughout the internet with the assumption that memes are only a small subset of the information in our cultural ecosystem. The frequent application of the qualifier viral reinforces the sense that memes are somehow hostile, foreign, and invasive. In other words, a paranoid notion of the meme. The viral metaphor plays into fears of persuasion and mind control on the basis of a false dichotomy between self and non-self. Viral memes invade a mind, that is otherwise presumed to be integral and impregnable. But meme theory, as originally constructed, posits a much more radical notion of subjectivity. All information, including thoughts, is composed of memes, and even the most banal exchange of information is an exchange of memes. If we recall the observation that surprise parties are technically conspiracies, right, because you're not telling the person you're throwing the party for, then happy birthday to you is just as viral as a Nike commercial. It is worth dwelling on the construction of the viral before turning to the role of memes in conspiracy, because the viral metaphor, with its implications of malignancy and even agency, threatens to subsume memetics into a fundamentally conspiratorial worldview. But my intent is the opposite. Rather than allow a discussion of memes to facilitate paranoia, I want to use memetics in order to posit the circulation of elements of conspiracy theory in the absence of any real agency at all. The memes of conspiracy are the familiar tropes, images, and phrases that over the lifespan of a given theory reach beyond the initiated, becoming part of the larger discourse. While the dissemination might be the result of an agitation by conspiracy partisans, such as the creation of fake news that was discussed yesterday, if anything, their spread is facilitated much more effectively by satirists and debunkers. Consider, for example, the following list. Black helicopters, one world government, men in black, where do we know that phrase from? New World Order, tinfoil hats, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, and FEMA camps. At least some of these phrases will be familiar to people, including those who are not steeped in conspiratorial lore. Clearly, each phrase can theoretically be used in an entirely neutral context, but they're so thoroughly engaged in a conspiratorial semantic web that their very invocation serves as shorthand for a larger narrative. Whether that narrative is taken seriously or not is, in this instance, unimportant. It is the constituent memes of conspiracy, rather than the theory itself, that most easily reach the largest number of people. Conspiratorial memes could be an unintentional trap for the speaker who invokes them naively. President George W. Bush, in a speech to Congress on September 11th, 1990, September 11th, he delivered a speech to Congress laying out his vision of the world in the aftermath of the Cold War with the, quote, the very real prospect of a new world order. Now, a charitable and plausible reading of Bush's phrasing would be that the president had no idea that he was employing a phrase that had been circulating in extreme right-wing groups for over a decade, and President Bush having no idea is usually a good assumption. A conspiracist might see the speech as the moment when Bush finally tipped his hand that he is actually working on behalf of the New World Order. To see how the memes of conspiracy migrate, let's turn to conspiracy theory's original sin, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The story of the Protocols is well known. They were lifted from a French satire by Maurice Joly and a German novel by Hermann Goethe, yet this has not stopped their circulation as revelatory texts over a century later. Originally published in Russian in 1903, the Protocols purport to be the minutes of a meeting of a secret cabal of Jews who were responsible for nearly every aspect of world affairs. Though it was not the first tract to make such an argument, it became one of the most successful. Readers who are not die-hard anti-Semites or committed conspiracy theorists are likely to have difficulty taking the Protocols seriously as a text. Starting with the book's very premise, the leaders of top-secret global conspiracy take meticulous notes for their records, the author of the Protocols makes little effort to render them plausible. In fact, if the Protocols are bad nonfiction, they're much worse when read as the author's fantasy. On top of everything else, the Protocols are a crime against fiction. The conspirators prove to be laughably cartoonish villains with no attempt to give them even a hint of moral complexity. The author simply can't help but make sure that the villain's own words reflect an awareness of their own evil, as well as an indication of the good that they abhor. For instance, at one point, someone in the protocol says, "The people, under our guidance, have annihilated the aristocracy, who were their one and only defense and foster mother for the sake of their own advantage, which is inseparably bound up from the well-being of the people." There's a message there. Sentences like this are more than just explanations of an imagined evil. They're propaganda for the moral and social framework that is implicitly the only bulwark against the Jews. The bulk of the book describes the elders' use of both capitalism and communism to destroy traditional institutions and consolidate power through money. Unsurprisingly, the Jews here are a stand-in for modernity that the authors of the Protocols could see as only disastrous. The Protocols did not invent the idea of a secret society's responsibility for all the world's ills. A century of European panics over Freemasons deserves at least some of the credit. But perhaps inadvertently, the Protocols add a key word to the lexicon of right-wing conspiracy, a word that in other contexts could seem, if not innocent, at least unthreatening: the goyim. The goyim, or goyim in all caps, capital G, capital O, capital Y, capital I, capital M, as it's always written in this text, is a Hebrew term whose literal meaning is the nations, but which functions simply as Gentiles, even if its deployment is something of a slur. But the goyim of the Protocols are not your embarrassing xenophobic Jewish grandfather's goyim. They are the hapless dupes of the Jews who control the world. Like the New World Order discussed in before, goyim travels a circuitous mimetic path. More often than not, its utterance by non-Jews, particularly on the internet, marks the speaker as surely as a swastika tattoo marks a member of the Aryan nations. The Aryan nations, by the way, is a hate group whose name, ironically enough, could be freely translated back into Hebrew as Aryan Goyim. The term goyim appears frequently in internet comment sections about the issues that animate conspiracists in America. To the uninitiated, the word seems strangely out of context. It's a word that's used by Jews. In actuality, the goyim meme travels with its own portable context, placing the rest of the commenter's utterances within the framework of neo-fascist conspiracies. So, here's a question. What then is a conspiracy theory? My answer is that this is the wrong question. Rather than develop yet another definition of conspiracy, we instead should have a broader understanding of the spectrum on which conspiratorial thought lies. There is always the danger of privileging the elaborate, methodical conspiracy theories that tend to get the most attention. To confine our inquiry to full-fledged conspiracies would be misleading in two regards. First, it would overestimate conspiracy by aligning it solely with the semiotic expansionism that marks the biggest conspiracies, thereby playing into their incessant self-aggrandizement. But second, it would underestimate conspiracy by restricting it only to identifiable conspiratorial narratives, and thus ignore the multiple ways in which the conspiratorial mode expresses itself in the short-term adoption of a paranoid stance, as well as through the invocation of conspiratorial memes. And finally, we no longer need speculate about the state of mind or intent of those who espouse conspiracy. The problem with the term paranoid was never really about the accuracy of an alleged diagnosis. It was about the automatic alienation of the people studied, the paranoid conspirators, from the people doing the studying, overeducated academics. That distinction has limited utility and is in fact an obstacle to understanding. Though we may not believe in alien abductions, Zionist control of the media, or a plot to use fluoridated water to turn our children gay, we share with these conspiracists the habit of thought that make fiction, storytelling, and politics possible. We are all conspiracy theorists. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. And we have a first question by Eva Ilus.
Yeah, I have a very small question. You emphasize...
Oh, could you wait for the microphone, please? Yeah, thank you.
Very small question. I really liked the ways in which you view paranoia as a cognitive, I would say, or cognitive or cultural style. And if I understand you, but this is where I was not sure I understood, actually. So you're making the claim that there is an affinity, and I wasn't sure if it was a causality between the ways in which we approach fiction and the ways in which we approach the social world. And so it seemed as if you were saying that that same cognitive style, which looks for coherence and connections, is at work also in our interpretation of ordinary events. It's a claim I really like. But only that it seems to me that conspiracy theories are not only about finding hidden meanings and connections, but mostly, and the last example you gave, mostly about power. It is about, and then it seems to me that the connection with fiction, the use of cognitive fictional style in a way, doesn't work or doesn't work as well.
Thank you. No, that's an excellent question. In terms of the use of fiction, I'm arguing sort of deliberately provocatively, but I also really believe this for whatever my intention is worth, that we are trained by, even if we're not literary scholars, we're trained by the habit of consuming stories to expect coherence and to expect things to work together, and that there's something in the nature of storytelling and narrative that is essentially cognate to a paranoid worldview, and that every narrative, if it works, every successful narrative is a conspiracy. And that we train ourselves as children all the way up to understand connections and to see things working together. And therefore, we cultivate habits that are very much like conspiratorial thought, just in the realm of simply enjoying entertainment. Now, the question of power is an excellent one. I would say that power is always involved, but power isn't always the main emphasis. So for instance, vaccines, right? Vaccines causing autism. So I have an autistic son who goes to a school for autistic children, and I actually have to keep my mouth shut around all these crazy people who believe that vaccines cause autism. And keeping my mouth shut is really hard, but necessary. And when you talk to them, eventually they'll start talking about the drug companies or people trying to protect themselves, absolutely. But I think in their stories, power isn't where it starts. Where it starts, because if power were where it started, I think it would work better if there are people out there who just really want their children to become autistic. And actually what happens is power is kind of covering up for itself for what is, interestingly, more often conceived of as a mistake. I think, and you can see power in storytelling as well. So I agree that power is important, but I think it's not always what conspiracy theories are primarily about. The big ones, of course, are the biggest ones that we know of, but they don't have to put power front and center.
Dominic Bonfiglio?
Did you see the film in 2016, the documentary by Adam Curtis, Hypernormalization?
No, I did not.
Adam Curtis, hypernormalization. I mean, the term is taken from a Soviet professor who taught in the United States, is Alexei Yurchak.
Yes.
I think it's, and it was used to describe the kind of experience of a failing society in the Soviet Union in the 70s, and a need to create sort of an alternative reality that wasn't failing, to kind of, and then at some point that alternative reality became more real than the actual failing society, and somehow that contradiction kind of led to the implosion of the Soviet Union. But he then took it and applied it to a lot of other things, basically the sort of need to create fictions to explain things that are either too complicated or too screwed up to deal with anymore for most normal people, where it's sort of a flight into fiction as a way of dealing with a disappointing reality. I don't have a question, I just had to think of that as a way to frame some of what you were talking about.
Sure, and I haven't seen the documentary, but I'm familiar with Yurchak's writing. For me, what I take out of Yurchak, more than hypernormalization, is in fact the ability of people in late Soviet times to go through the motions and say the right things without committing to believing in them, but also without fighting them either. Just doing them to do them and get by, right? So his example that I always like is you're at a meeting of the Communist Youth League, the Komsomol, and you want to go home. And there's a vote condemning something or other, Reagan doing something, or I don't know what. You're supposed to vote. And there's this one guy there who is a principled would-be dissident who raises his hand and says, no, this is wrong. We can't just blithely discuss all of this. We can't just blithely accept this. We should be discussing this, we should be debating it. And that the reaction of everybody else is not, he's wrong or he's right, but God, can't we just go home? It's like arguing with human resources. You nod when human resources speak because you want to get out of there. And so what you have then is the performance of what looks like conviction, but that actually has nothing to do with conviction or with fighting conviction, but simply something that is very effective about going about your life, whereas the person who's actually taking this stuff seriously is a total buzzkill. And is the last person you want in the room, because he's the one keeping you from, say, going home and listening to all the rock music that you just condemned during the course of the meeting.
Michael Butter.
Thank you so much for that talk. I couldn't agree with. I couldn't agree more with the idea that we're all in a way conspiracy theorists, and we all like to give into conspiracy theory playfully. And I think the people who are actually best or worst at that are people like the two of us, literary critics. Because we always tell our students that the text that they're reading has a hidden meaning, and they sometimes think we're complete idiots because we say it's all about sexuality and whatever, and they don't see that. We point out to them that if you take this passage on page 7 and connect it to the passage on page 352, Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, we kind of assume that it has all been planned, but it's no longer the intention of the author. So we, in a way, you could link this back to the idea about the social sciences. It's just the text that is doing that suddenly, not discourse, but the text. So I think the parallels are absolutely there. And I also wanted to thank you for giving me this idea with the memes, because I think it made me understand something about the protocols of the elders of Zion, because, I mean, nobody reads the protocols.
They're horrible.
And nobody ever read it, because what people read, of course, were the prefaces, the new introductions. And so, would you agree that one could think of the protocols maybe as a repertoire of conspiracy memes that are then, in a way, taken out of that repertoire and integrated into all kinds of new contexts where editors, other people who just quote one sentence and then run with that as in order to make their larger point about a specific Jewish conspiracy that they're detecting at exactly that moment?
No, absolutely. So I think even if the protocols were a more successful artistic text that people enjoyed reading, which is a big counterfactual, it would still be a repository of memes, but it might be something more than that, or it might be a more effective repository of some much more specific targeted memes. Instead, in fact, what you get is all the stuff you can get from not reading the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the stuff that has floated free from it, because reading it is such a miserably unpleasant experience. From a mimetic point of view, that means the protocols of the Elders of Zion are a success because they've generated these things, but not because they actually make people read it. But they do make people reprint it. But if we were to imagine it as a fun book, then it could be more effective, not just as a kind of generalized approach to Jewish conspiracy, but of actually convincing people of this particular model from start to finish. So the Turner Diaries, for instance, which inspired McVeigh, I've read they're not great, but they're a lot more entertaining than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and therefore you have something that people probably read, and therefore could get not just the idea that there's a race war, but the idea that, oh, the race war is going to play out like it did when they were fighting that guy in chapter 22. And so it can have a much more targeted effect if it's a better vehicle for its memes.
Antonio Casilli.
Thank you for your talk. Interestingly enough, as Michael's talk brought to my mind, at least, the Foucault's notion of regimes of truth, your talk brought to my mind another notion by a French historian, Paul Veyne, and this notion is the programs of truth. In a book written some 30 years ago, Paul Veyne, and the book was about if the Greek believed in their own myth. That was the title. Did the Greek believe in their myth? When he was asking himself these questions, which of course resonates with your own idea of believing in conspiracies and conspiracy and paranoia as a mode, he said, well, okay, they believed in these myths, but to a point, to an extent. If they stop believing if the myth stops serving their own interests. So this goes, this works for an oracle, this works for a conspiracy. If we interpret conspiracies as a mode, as you do, it also works with statistics. I mean, we stop believing in statistics if they do not serve our own interests. Now, my point is, and my question for you is, could you please develop on the role of will in your own perception of conspiracies and paranoia? Does will play a role? Like, you know, in X-Files, I want to believe.
I want to believe. That's right. I want to believe actually brings us back to the thing about whether or not the Greeks believe in their own myths, which I think is great. Before I get to your question, because I think, and I haven't read the book and I've just written it down to read it, but where that gets back to the whole problem of, you know, over-educated intellectuals and the people we're talking about, I think of, so as a secular atheist person, and I imagine there may be other people like me in this room, one of the things that I've made sure to remind myself of and try to remind my students of, especially, I read a lot of Catholic stuff for them, for instance, because there's so many great Catholic texts. There's great texts about Catholics exploring space and science fiction, that a non-believer tends to assume that a believer believes everything and has no doubt. And that in fact, the best, as we know, the best stories, the best narratives of religious belief are about doubt. And the experience of belief and the experience of religion is about wrestling with doubt. And we caricature believers as people who just, like, you know, got it. When in a sense it's more of trying to stay in a mode and probably failing sometimes. And that even people who say they believe in the inerrant truth of the Bible might sometimes, well, you know, not exactly, especially if they don't know their Bible very well, which is probably most of them. So I think that is a corrective for people like us, in fact, when we see a system and we see people involved in a system, and we believe in we tend to assume a kind of complete identity between the person who's in the system and the system itself. That's one of the things that I think Yuich's writings really helps with too, in talking about the late Soviet Union. Now, when we get to the question about
Will?
Will, yes, thank you. I don't address will as a kind of post-structural thing, but I think in part because I'm assuming I can never really know what's going on in someone else's head, and therefore I'm not trying. I'm also assuming, and again I can't prove it, something which I think resonates back with yesterday's discussion with a lot of things we've been talking about, that our emotional predispositions precede our logical conclusions. And therefore, often the will to believe in conspiracy, to actually commit yourself long-term rather than just for the moment, is more related to whatever your own internal makeup is, to your psychology, to your emotions, than it is to logical thought. In which case, where's the question of choice and will in there? I'm not sure how to get at that. I think typically when we talk about choice and will, this is where I want to tear my hair out when talking to economists. It's, you know, I sit down there and I think, well, I could eat this chocolate bar, but it's going to make me fat. And then I've decided, well, I'm going to be fat anyways, I'm going to have the chocolate bar. And there's no emotional content. I'll have another one because I've decided to be fat. And I've decided not to get a job and be on welfare. All this idea of rational choice that Russian literature really helps us not believe in. I want to assign every rational choice theory Dostoevsky. But I have trouble, given all of that, I have trouble seeing where will and choice comes in, and I'm suspicious of it politically because of the whole neoliberal choice thing. But that's not a direct answer, I'd say.
So, since we are at the topic of food, not to shorten your lunch break unnecessarily, I have 3 more questions. I would ask for short questions and short answers.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
sure.
So last row, please. Yeah. Could you back?
Sorry. Me? Yeah.
No. Sorry, you are.
Thank you so much for this talk. I have so many questions,
Yeah.
but I'll ask one. With this idea of conspiracy being on a continuum, does that conception of it help us identify different kinds of conspiracies leading to different political consequences? And does it help us identify which kinds of, or which conspiracies on the continuum are going to be really dangerous for our politics?
My short answer?
Yes.
No. I don't think so.
So maybe we can.
Still a good question.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Has Steenvat. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I think we can all agree that most of all conspiracy theories are bad, reverse enlightenment, etc., etc., etc. But also I think, if I understood you correctly, it's just perfectly human and a mirror, in a way, of who we are. My question is, can they also be even used and instrumentalized for something good? And maybe just to give you an example, I was just reading a rant of a pediatrician, I believe from Ohio the other day, who was just telling how he's been sitting in front of, you know, staunch anti-vaxxer moms on a daily basis. And he tries to explain to them by facts that it's a terrible idea, and fails, of course. And then he has switched to different tactics, and he would ask them, have you ever thought of the possibility that this anti-vaxxer thing is a plot by China and Russia to harm our population? And he tells that this is incredibly successful.
No, that's brilliant. I mean, of course you can use, since everybody's using conspiracy probably tends to think they're doing it for the sake of good. So if I'm assuming that we all are kind of on the same part of the political spectrum, we could, if we had power, probably come up with conspiracy theories that could be useful to us. And in fact, I think the left has a history of doing that when it comes to, you know, the plutocracy running things, which is also probably true, but whatever. So one can. The question is how comfortable you are with that, and how comfortable you are with the consequences for degrading any further discussion of what's true. I'm kind of comfortable.
So you have the last question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the beginning of your talk, you said something about art in this surroundings. What is the difference between a good fortune teller and conspirative Ideologie?
So a good fortune teller reads the information in front of them and puts it all together really well. So the difference is probably a difference of scale, and a difference of intent, and a difference of possible harm or simply results, right? I think a good fortune teller ends up giving you advice that's so general you're probably not going to do something really terrible. But yes, it's the same. It's playing on the same. It's using the same capacities and playing on the same habits as conspiracy theories.
So thank you very much for your talk and for your discussion.